The chamber was large enough to hold a small city inside it. The ceiling curved upward like the inside of a shell, and the walls were lined with seats that rose in wide rings, one above the other, all the way to the top. Every seat was filled. 41 species had sent their representatives, and every one of them had come to watch the same thing, the end of Earth's place in the Galactic Council. Junho stood at the center of the floor. He was a tall man, not young anymore, with short gray hair and a plain dark suit that had no medals or decorations on it. He held a small datapad under his left arm. His hands were still. He had been standing there for almost 3 hours while speaker after speaker rose from their seat to say why Earth deserved to be removed. The Velthari ambassador was the loudest. He had 4 arms and a voice that clicked and buzzed through the translation system before coming out smooth on the other side. He said that humans were dangerous. He said that Earth had broken trade agreements, moved into territory it had no right to enter, and sold weapons technology to species that the Council had not approved. He called humans a disease that smiled while spreading. He sat down to the sound of agreement from nearly every section of the chamber. The Sorvun elder followed. She was old and slow and spoke in a low voice, but her words were sharp. She said the Council had been patient with Earth for too long. She said patience had a cost, and the galaxy had paid it. She asked the chamber to vote in favor of full removal, no exceptions, no delays. Junho listened to all of it. He did not move. He did not react. When a few representatives looked at him expecting anger or at least discomfort, they found nothing. He looked like a man waiting for a bus. When it was finally his turn to speak, he walked to the podium, set his datapad on the surface, and looked out at the chamber. He said nothing for a moment. Just looked around slowly, taking in the faces, the colors, the shapes of 41 different kinds of thinking life. Then he said, "We understand the charges. We have nothing to add." A ripple of confusion moved through the seats above. Several translators checked their systems, thinking something had been lost. An aide near the Velthari section leaned over to whisper something to her superior. The Sorvun elder stared. That was all Junho said. He picked up his datapad, stepped back from the podium, and returned to his spot on the floor. The vote came quickly after that. 38 in favor of removal, 3 abstentions, no votes against. Earth was out. The senior official at the head of the chamber read the result in a formal voice. Following the old words that the council used for such moments, he named Earth specifically. He named the terms of the removal. He said that Earth's access to council stations, council lanes, council communications networks, and council records would be closed within 30 galactic days. The chamber waited. Everyone in that room had studied humans at some point. It was hard not to. Humans had a long and well-recorded history of reacting to things loudly. They had wars that lasted for generations over small pieces of land. They made films about fighting back. They wrote songs about not giving up. Their history was full of moments where they were told no and responded by building something louder than the no itself. So the chamber waited for it, the protest, the threat, the table-slamming moment that would give everyone a story to tell later. Junho straightened his jacket. He tucked the datapad under his arm. He looked at the head official once, gave a single short nod, and said, "Understood. We'll show ourselves out." Then he turned and walked toward the main doors. Not fast, not slow, just walking, the way a person walks when they have somewhere to be and plenty of time to get there. The doors opened as he reached them and closed behind him with a soft sound, the kind of sound that a well-made door makes when everything is working properly. The chamber did not erupt. It went quiet instead. The Velthari ambassador looked at the Sorvun elder across the floor. The elder looked back. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. A junior Sorvun official leaned forward and broke the silence by clearing his throat. Someone in the upper seats coughed. Slowly, the chamber began to come back to life, representatives turning to each other, speaking in low voices, the noise building back up the way it does after something unexpected. But something was different. The celebration that everyone had expected to feel did not arrive in the way they had imagined. There was no real satisfaction in the room. The removal had passed. The vote had gone through. Earth was gone. And yet, the room felt strange. There was a tension sitting in the air like the feeling before rain. A young analyst named Varaith sat in the lower observer section. She worked for the Velthari delegation, handling data and reports. She had been watching Junho the whole time. She had expected the same thing everyone else expected. She had been ready to file a report on Earth's emotional response, on the threats, on the drama. Instead, she had watched a man nod and walk away. She opened her data screen and pulled up everything she had on Earth. Resource counts, fleet numbers, territory maps, trade records, exploration logs. She went through it all carefully, looking for something. She was not sure what, but she had a feeling in her chest that was not comfortable. The kind of feeling that comes when something important has been missed. After an hour, she had not found anything specific. Everything looked normal. Everything looked correct. But that was exactly what bothered her. A species that had just been removed from the most powerful political body in the known galaxy should not look normal. There should be gaps, panic, emergency signals, something. There was nothing. She flagged her findings and sent them up the chain. She wrote one line at the bottom of the report. They were not surprised. They were prepared. No one responded to her that day. They were too busy writing speeches about the success of the vote. She closed her screen and sat back in her chair and thought about the way Junho had nodded, just once, like it was nothing, like he had already known the outcome before he walked through the door. That thought stayed with her for a long time. 3 galactic years passed. The council moved on, the way large and powerful things always move on, with paperwork and meetings and the comfortable feeling that the right decision had been made. The removal of Earth became a settled fact, something to reference in future discussions about rules and enforcement. A clean example of the system working. But the galaxy is not a clean place. In the first year, the changes were small enough to explain away. A few shortages in the Mevari agricultural zones, where crops that had been growing with the help of human-designed soil conditioning systems began to fail. The council assigned a team to look into it. The team recommended a replacement solution. The replacement solution took 14 months to produce and did not work as well as the human one. No one officially said why. The report simply noted that the original technology was no longer available through standard channels. A Sorvoon cargo ship called the Ravan went missing in the second year. Then a second ship, the Oru, disappeared near the same area. When investigators checked the warp lane both ships had used, they found something unexpected. The lane had shifted. A gravity shear, invisible and unmapped, had opened up where the corridor used to be safe. The lane had not been checked in over a year. It was a human maintenance route. Humans had maintained it quietly and routinely for decades, as part of an informal agreement that nobody had ever written down, because nobody had ever imagined it would stop. The investigation report was filed. The lane was flagged. New maintenance contracts were drawn up with 3 different species to cover the gap. The process took 8 months. By then, 6 more ships from other species had changed their routes, and 2 of them had arrived late enough to cause contract disputes that lasted another year. 40,000 Mevari civilians died from the Dryvac plague. This was not reported as a consequence of Earth's removal. The official cause listed was a delay in vaccine supply chains. What the official report did not note, because no one thought to check, was that a completed vaccine had been sitting in an Earth lab station above the planet U for almost a full year before the banishment. It had been weeks from formal delivery. After the vote, the delivery was simply never sent. No one at the lab station felt it was their job anymore. Earth was no longer a council member. The vaccine was Earth's resource. Without a standing agreement, there was no mechanism to ask for it, and no one from the council ever did. These were not acts of war. They were not sabotage. They were absences. Gaps left by a presence that had quietly been doing more than anyone had tracked or recorded. Commander Nara knew all of this. She sat in the operations room of a station called Yongwon, which sat at the edge of what used to be Earth's outer territory. The room had large screens on every wall and a long central table covered in charts and orbital maps. Nara was a practical woman who had run deep space operations for 12 years and had very little patience for things that did not have a function. She kept the station clean, kept her crew focused, and kept the mission moving. The mission officially was deep space survey work. New systems, unmapped regions, and a resource assessment, standard enough that it barely registered on council reports back when Earth still filed them. Now it registered nowhere at all. What was actually happening was different. Over the past several years, Yongwon and the fleet operating under Nara's command had been building. not ships, though there were more of those too. They had been building outposts, small stations, then larger ones placed one after another in the dark space beyond the edge of Council-charted territory. Each one connected to the next with communication relays. Each one supplied and staffed. Each one capable of operating independently for years. They had started before the banishment. The banishment had simply removed the last reason to slow down. Nara looked at the map every morning. The network of outposts stretched further each month. She thought of it less as territory and more as reach. The difference mattered. Territory could be contested. Reach was harder to argue with. Far from Yongwon, in a government office on Earth that had no sign on the door, Intelligence Director Sarai ran a different kind of operation. She had a team of 12 people and access to signals from across the galaxy. Her job, in simple terms, was to listen. She monitored council broadcasts, diplomatic channels, civilian networks, commercial traffic. She collected information the way other people collect receipts, habitually without drama, and with a system that made it easy to find anything later. She had started a document 2 months after the banishment. She called it internally, without any official name, the List. It was a record of every function that Earth had quietly performed across the galaxy that no one had ever formally noticed or credited. Agricultural support, lane maintenance, medical research sharing, emergency communications relay hosting, 12 categories and growing. By the end of year 2, the list was 47 pages long. She did not share it widely. She reviewed it often. In a lecture hall on Earth's orbital academy above Seoul, a woman named Yuna stood before a room of 30 students and spoke about patience. Yuna was a philosopher, which in the context of Earth's current government meant she was one of the people who had helped shape the strategy behind the silence. She was not famous. She did not appear in official records of the council period. She had simply spent years thinking carefully about one question: what does power actually look like when it is not performing? She told her students that silence, properly used, was not emptiness. It was a container. Something was always inside it. The question was whether the other party was smart enough to wonder what. She told them about old Earth military thinking, the kind practiced centuries ago in slow wars where supply lines mattered more than armies. She said the most dangerous move in any contest was not the attack. It was the withdrawal that made the other side realize, too late, how much they had been depending on you. A student asked her if Earth was being cruel, letting species suffer when it could have helped. Yuna was quiet for a moment. Then she said that the council had made a decision with full information available to them. They had chosen removal. The consequences of removal were the council's to manage. Earth was not responsible for carrying the weight of a house it had been told to leave. She paused and added that Earth was not happy about the suffering. It simply understood that fixing it for free would teach the wrong lesson. The student wrote it down. Several others did too. Back in her observation post, Verith had been promoted. Her report on Earth's unusual calm had finally made it to a senior official named Dravash, who read it twice and then called her into his office. He asked her to continue watching, to document everything, to tell him if anything changed. She told him something had already changed. It was just that most of it was invisible, because it was defined by what was no longer there. He did not fully understand that, but he told her to keep watching anyway. She did. And she started her own list, separate from her official files, in a personal document she kept encrypted and backed up in 3 places. She was beginning to understand that what she was watching was not a collapse. It was a very deliberate, very quiet exhale, the kind that comes before something entirely different. She did not know what, not yet, but she kept watching. By the 5th year, the galaxy had stopped expecting anything dramatic from Earth. The drama had never come, and after a while, people stop waiting for something that does not arrive. The council had new problems to deal with. Border disputes between the Velthari and a cluster of mid-systems near the Drivak corridor, an economic slowdown in the Sorvun manufacturing zones, and an ongoing argument about deep-water mining rights on a moon that 3 species all claimed at the same time. Earth's removal had become old news, settled, finished, except that it wasn't. The change was happening in the margins, in the parts of the galaxy that the Council did not look at carefully, because there was nothing there that seemed worth looking at carefully. The fringe worlds, the non-member systems, the species that had applied for council membership and been denied or had never applied because they had learned from watching others that the process was long and the result was uncertain. Earth had found them, or rather Earth had gone to them, which was different. Finding implies accident. What Earth did was deliberate. A human trade ship called the Bada arrived at a small world called Urvash in year 4. Urvash had about 60 million people, a functioning but basic technology level, and a single export, a mineral compound used in certain types of insulation for space vehicles, that the Council had been buying from them at a price set by Council trade committees, which meant a price set far below what the compound was actually worth. The Urvash government had complained about this for 30 years through official channels. Nothing had changed. The Bada's captain sat down with the Urvash trade minister and spent 2 days going over numbers. When she left, Earth and Urvash had a new agreement. The price was fair. The terms were equal. The contract included a clause that said both parties had the right to renegotiate every 5 years based on updated market value. The Urvash minister had never seen a contract with that clause before. He read it 3 times to make sure it was real. That was one world, but it was also the model for 43 others over the following 2 years. Earth was not doing this out of pure generosity. Nara had made that clear in the early planning sessions aboard Yongwon. Generosity alone does not build a network. Partnership does. Earth needed resources, access, communication relays in new regions, and friendly ports at the edge of uncharted space. The fringe worlds needed technology, medical access, fair trade terms, and someone who would answer when they sent a signal. Both sides had something real to offer. The agreements reflected that. What grew out of those agreements was not called anything official for a long time. It was just a web of quiet connections, deals honored on time, problems solved together. A medical team from Earth arrived on a fringe world called Savat when a respiratory illness swept through 3 of its cities. They came without being asked through official channels because Savat's government had a direct contact number for an Earth Health Coordination Office, a number given to them 18 months earlier as part of a simple information sharing agreement. The team stayed for 6 weeks. When they left, they also left behind a small diagnostic lab, fully stocked, with a training program for local staff built into the equipment. General Kaboom was a quiet man who had run Earth's autonomous defense systems for 9 years. He had a reputation for being thorough rather than aggressive. He thought about problems the way an engineer thinks about them. What are the weak points, and how do you make them structurally sound? When Nara brought him into the network planning discussions, he did not suggest military bases or weapon stockpiles. He suggested early warning relays, shared emergency frequencies, a mutual response protocol that guaranteed any member of the network could call for help and receive a documented commitment in return. Every fringe world that joined the network got these things as standard. The protocol was not showy, it was functional. But what it told each of those worlds was something no council document had ever told them. You are worth defending. That meant something. More than most of the Earth planners had anticipated. Back inside the Council, the Velthari ambassador received an unofficial message from a contact he trusted. The message was short. It said that 3 of the Council's outer trade partners had quietly renewed agreements with Earth-connected intermediaries rather than going through Council standard channels. The ambassador did not reply immediately. He had the message verified first. Then he called a closed meeting with 4 other senior representatives. The meeting lasted 6 hours. Afterward, the ambassador authorized a private inquiry, not an official council investigation because an official one would require a formal vote and too many eyes, but a careful, quiet look into what Earth was actually doing in the uncharted regions. The inquiry came back with information that the ambassador read alone in his office with the door closed. The network was real. It had 31 member systems at that point, though the number was growing faster than the inquiry could track. It had infrastructure, agreements, a functioning emergency response system, and it operated completely outside council jurisdiction. The ambassador thought about the wording of the banishment resolution. He had helped write it. At the time, it had felt like removing a problem from the room. Now, reading this report, he understood that what they had actually done was remove a problem from a room and give it an entire building to fill instead. An unofficial message was composed and sent through backroom channels to a retired Earth diplomat named Junho. asking in carefully non-committal language whether Earth might be interested in discussing the possibility of renewed dialogue with the Council. Junho received the message on a small station above Titan. He was drinking tea at the time and reading a paper book, which he preferred over screens when he had the choice. He read the message once, then again. Then he set his cup down, folded the message closed, and placed it on the table beside his book. He sat quietly for a while, looking out at the slow curve of Saturn's rings through the viewport. He picked up his book again. The message sat on the table. He had always known it would come eventually. He had told Sarai years ago that it would come, and she had said she knew, and they had agreed that when it did, they would not rush. Rushing was for people who were not sure they were winning. Back on Urvash, the trade minister stood at his window and watched an Earth supply vessel dock at their new port facility, a port that Earth engineers had helped design and build. Behind him on his desk was a stack of applications from Urvash citizens who wanted to train in Earth technical programs. He thought about the 30 years his government had spent asking the council to adjust the trade price. 30 years of formal letters and polite rejections, and being told that the committee would review it next cycle. One conversation with an Earth captain had changed more than 3 decades of trying through the right channels. He was not angry about that, but he was thoughtful about it. He was beginning to understand what it meant that Earth had been the one to come to him, and not the other way around. And he was beginning to understand what kind of power that gave to the people doing the choosing. Soraya received a signal that evening. 3 more worlds had applied to join the network. She updated her records, sent confirmations to the relevant coordinators, and then sat back in her chair and looked at the map on her wall. The map showed the network's reach in soft blue lines against the dark background of uncharted space. A year ago, the lines had been sparse. Now they spread like light. She thought about Yuna's words from years before, the container and what was inside it. She understood now what had been inside the silence all along: infrastructure, trust, the patient, steady work of making yourself genuinely useful to people who had been ignored long enough to appreciate it completely. That was what had been inside the silence, and it was ready. The station had no official name on any public record. It appeared in internal Earth documents as Threshold Command, and the people who worked there called it simply the Post, because that was what it felt like. An outpost at the edge of everything known, looking outward into something that no one had named yet. It sat in uncharted space, far beyond the reach of council sensors, far beyond the reach of anything. The nearest mapped system was 11 hours away at standard warp. The post itself was not large. It had been built for function, not for comfort, though the engineers who had spent years there had done what people always do in small spaces they live in for a long time. They had made it feel like somewhere. There were plants in the corridor near the labs. Someone had painted the inside of the main airlock door with a picture of a mountain range from a country that no longer had national borders, from a planet that the council had once tried to tell how to organize itself. Scientist Yun had worked at the post for 4 years. He was not the kind of man who talked about his work at gatherings or explained it to people who had not asked. He was the kind of man who got up early, ate the same breakfast every morning, and then spent 12 hours doing something very carefully before doing it again the next day. He had a team of 19, and he knew each of them well enough to tell when they were tired before they said so. The project they were working on was not a secret because anyone had ordered it to be. It was a secret because it was not finished, and Hyun did not talk about things that were not finished. It was a simple rule that had served him well. The idea behind the project was not new. Warp travel had existed for a long time. Every space-capable species in the known galaxy used some version of it. The Council had spent centuries refining the standard model, and it worked reliably and well, within limits. The limits were distance and time. A long warp jump took hours or days to calculate and execute. The longest jumps took weeks of preparation. For a species that wanted to move quickly across truly large distances, not the distances between systems in a cluster, but the kind of distances that separated entire regions of the galaxy, standard warp was not fast enough. What Hyun's team had been building was something different, not an improvement on warp. a replacement for the logic underneath it. Instead of bending space to bring 2 points closer together for travel, the new system worked with something that did not have a simple name, yet in any language, a property of space that existed in the gaps between what the math described and what actually happened at very high energies. Hyun called it fold edge behavior in his notes. His team called it the slippage. Whatever it was called, it did one thing when properly manipulated. It moved a vessel from one point to another with no travel time between them. Not less time. No time. The vessel left. It arrived. Between those two events, nothing happened because there was no between. They had proven the math 6 years ago. They had built a working small-scale demonstration 3 years ago, moving an object the size of a chair across a distance of 40 kilometers. They had spent the time since then scaling it up, fixing the problems that scale created, and being very careful. Commander Nara arrived at the post on the morning of the test. She had traveled for 2 days to get there and had not slept much either day. Not from stress, but from the particular alertness that comes when something you have been working toward for a long time is about to either happen or fail. She greeted Hyun in the corridor outside the main lab, and he handed her a cup of coffee without being asked, because he had been expecting her for exactly the time she arrived. They went over the numbers together for an hour. The probe was ready. It was a simple vessel, unmanned, carrying a signal beacon and a return system. It had been tagged with Earth's new independent banner. Not the old flag, but the new one. A deep blue field with a single white circle near the center, chosen specifically because it was simple enough to be unmistakable and could not be confused with a council marker. The target was a point in space 11,000 light-years away. At standard warp, a journey of decades. By council technology, the destination was not meaningfully reachable within a practical mission window. It was chosen specifically for that reason. The team gathered in the observation room. 20 people standing at screens and consoles, quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are very awake and very focused. Hyun stood at the central station. Nara stood beside him with her arms folded. No one made a speech. There was no countdown. Hyun checked the last readings, straightened up, and said, "Send it." The probe left the dock. On the screen, it moved outward for a few seconds, reaching the designated activation point. Then it was gone, not in the way things disappear in a standard warp, with the visible distortion and the flash of energy. It was simply there, and then it was not there. The screen showed empty space where the probe had been. 3 seconds passed. The beacon signal arrived, clean, strong, without distortion. The signal coordinates matched the target location exactly. The probe was 11,000 light-years away. 3 more seconds. The return ping. The probe was back. It was sitting 200 meters off the dock, undamaged, beacon still active, return system nominal. The room was very quiet. Someone at a console in the back coughed softly. One of the younger engineers pressed both hands flat against her station screen and breathed out slowly. Hyun looked at the data readout for a long time without moving. Then he looked at Nara. She was looking at the screen where the probe sat waiting, as ordinary and calm as a parked vehicle. She looked at it for a moment longer. Then she looked at Hyun and said, "Good, write it up." He almost smiled. He turned back to his station and began the documentation. Earth released a public statement 2 days later. It was 1 paragraph. It said that Earth's independent research program had successfully completed a test of a new transit technology. It described the technology in plain terms: point-to-point repositioning, no travel time, demonstrated range of 11,000 light-years. It said Earth looked forward to defining its own terms of engagement with the broader galactic community. It did not threaten anyone. It did not boast. It was written in the same flat, informational tone that engineers use when they are describing something that simply works. The council was in full session when the statement was translated and read aloud. No one stood up. No one moved quickly. The chamber did not erupt into shouting the way it had during the banishment vote. All that noise and certainty. Instead, representatives sat very still and began doing what intelligent beings do when they receive information that changes the shape of everything they thought they understood. They calculated. Every military deterrent the Council held over any non-member species rested on speed. Faster ships, better lanes, the ability to reach a conflict point before the other side could respond. The The council's power was not just economic or political, it was logistical. Logistics required time. Time was the foundation. Earth had just removed the foundation. The Velthari ambassador sat in his seat and did not speak for a long time. He was thinking about the day of the banishment vote. He was thinking about Junho walking out of the chamber, the nod, the straight back, the data pad tucked under his arm, the total absence of anger. He had thought at the time that Junho was being dignified in defeat. He understood now that was not what was happening at all. Junho had not been dignified in defeat. He had been patient in a position he already knew was not defeat. He had known about this. He had known that while the council was casting its vote, Earth scientists were already years into building something that would make the vote irrelevant. That was not dignity. That was something else entirely. Something the ambassador did not have a word for in his own language, though the human concept that came closest, when he looked it up later, was composure. A calm that does not need the situation to be different than it is because the situation is already going where it needs to go. Yuna was interviewed by an independent press outlet 3 weeks after the announcement. The interviewer asked her directly if the jump drive was revenge. She sat with the question for a moment, the way she always sat with questions, not performing thought but actually having it. Then she said, "No. It was our reason for not being angry." When you already know where you are going, it is very hard to feel upset about being asked to leave the room. The interviewer asked what she meant by that. She said that humanity had not spent the past 7 years waiting to be welcomed back. They had spent those years making sure that whether they came back or not, they would never again be in a position where someone else's decision could remove their ability to move forward. She said that was not revenge, it was architecture. The interview was shared widely, in the council, on fringe worlds, on systems that had only recently learned Earth existed. People read it in different languages and took different things from it. But almost everyone who read it, regardless of species, felt the same quiet thing in their chest when they reached the end. The same feeling Vareth had felt years ago watching Junho nod and walk out. The feeling of realizing, a long time after the moment had passed, that you had been watching something important and had not understood what it was until now. Soraya received the council's formal bilateral dialogue request 3 days after the interview. She printed it, walked to Junho's office on the Titan station, and placed it in front of him without saying anything. He read it. He set it down. He looked out at the rings for a while. Then he smiled, small and quiet, and said nothing. That was enough. Darai had been chosen for the assignment because she was 29 years old and had never worked inside the council system. The people who selected her had said that was a disadvantage. Sarai had said it was the most important qualification. Darai had no habits built from years of watching the council operate. She would not automatically treat it as the authority in the room because she had never been in a room where it was. She would simply walk in and do her job, the way someone does when they do not know they are supposed to be intimidated. Darai had read every file Soraya gave her. She had spent 4 months in preparation meetings. She had sat with Junho twice, once for a formal briefing, and once for a long, quiet dinner, where he said almost nothing instructional and mostly asked her about her life and what she thought about things. She had left that dinner understanding that the dinner was itself the lesson. He had wanted to know how she thought when no one was testing her, because the council chamber was going to test her constantly, and the only way to survive that was to think in exactly the same way you did when no one was watching. The morning she arrived at the Grand Chamber, she was not alone. Behind her walked 11 ambassadors. Each one represented a member of the Outer Accord, the name that had been formally adopted 4 months earlier for the network of species that had been building quietly in the margins of the galaxy for years. The ambassadors were different in every physical way. Different heights, different shapes, different ways of moving, different numbers of limbs. What they had in common was that none of them had ever sat at the main table of the Galactic Council before. Several of their species had been formally denied membership over the past century. One had been told it was not advanced enough to qualify. One had been told its territory was too close to a contested zone. One had simply never received a response to its application after submitting it 3 times. They walked into the chamber together. There was a full council session in progress, which had been the plan. The request for dialogue had specified a formal meeting date 2 weeks away. Derry had arrived 8 years early by the council's expectations and 2 weeks early by the formal schedule, and the combination of those two things meant that when she walked through the main doors, no one was ready for her. The chamber went quiet as the group entered. Representatives in the upper seats leaned forward. Several aides moved quickly toward their superiors to whisper. The translation systems activated with a low hum. In the center of the chamber floor, 12 chairs had been set up overnight by a human engineering team. Not in the visitor section, not in the observer gallery. At the main table, placed directly alongside the existing council seats, as equal positions, facing the same direction, part of the same ring. The head official stood and said that the placement of those chairs violated Chamber Protocol, Section 41, which governed the physical arrangement of the deliberation floor. Darai reached the table and set down a single document. It was thin. It had the outer accord symbol on the front, the same blue field and white circle from Earth's new banner, adapted slightly with a ring of smaller circles around it, one for each member species. She said, "We are not asking to be readmitted to the council." The chamber was very quiet. She said, "We are asking the council to consider membership in the accord." She sat down. Behind her, the 11 other ambassadors sat down as well, in the 12 chairs that had been placed at the table. The chairs were not identical. The engineering team had built each one to suit the species that would sit in it. The attention to that detail had taken a full week of coordination. It was not an accident. It was a statement, written in furniture, that said, "We knew exactly who was coming, and we made room for them specifically." The chamber erupted, not with one voice, but with many. Now overlapping and running into each other. The Sorvoon elder called for an emergency procedural review. The Velthari ambassador said nothing at all. 3 mid-tier council representatives began arguing with each other about what the correct response was. Several aides were running. Someone's translation device had a feedback error and was producing a high tone that nobody could locate the source of. Darai sat through all of it without moving. She looked ahead. She breathed steadily. She had been told by Junho to think of the noise as weather. Weather happened around you. It did not require a response. It required patience and a coat. It took 11 minutes for the chamber to settle enough for formal speech. When it did, the head official said that the council would need to adjourn to consider the situation. Dare said that was reasonable, and that the Accord delegation would be in their quarters. She stood, gathered the document she had placed on the table, and walked out with the 11 ambassadors behind her, in the same unhurried way that Junho had walked out 8 years ago, through the same doors, with the same soft mechanical sound as they closed. Junho watched it on a screen in his room on Yongwon. Nara stood next to him. Neither of them said anything for a while. On the screen, Dare's calm face was the last thing visible before the feed cut to the empty chamber. Nara said, "She's good." Junho said, "She's better than good." The council debated for 3 weeks. The debate was not always orderly. The Velthari delegation threatened withdrawal from the council entirely, which was a threat they had made before and never followed through on, and most of the other representatives knew it. The Sorvoon pushed for a compromise position, which was what they always did, and in this case the compromise was not unreasonable. 3 smaller council species submitted formal Accord membership applications during the second week, before the debate had even concluded, which caused a separate and extended argument about whether that was permitted under current treaty law. In the end, a framework was agreed upon. It was not a merger, it was not a surrender. It was a new structure, a joint assembly, with seats for both council members and Accord members, and no single body holding permanent authority over the other. Every decision in the joint assembly required a consensus process that gave smaller species the same weight as larger ones. There was a clause written specifically to prevent the kind of quiet exclusion that had kept fringe worlds outside the council for generations. The clause had been written by Yuna 18 months before the assembly existed because she had known the framework was coming and had wanted to make sure the language was right before anyone else got to write it. The signing took place in the Grand Chamber. Representatives from both sides sat at the same long table, the original council seats and the 12 Accord chairs from the night of Dare's arrival, now joined by more chairs added as the negotiations brought in new voices. The table had been extended twice during the 3 weeks. By the time of the signing, it ran the full length of the chamber floor. Dare signed for the Accord. The head official signed for the council. After the signing, The room was quieter than the vote had been 8 years ago. This quiet was different. Not the stunned quiet of people processing something they did not expect. This was the quiet of something being completed, the sound of a long project reaching its last step. Verath was in the room. She sat in the observer section, now as a senior diplomatic analyst for the Velthari delegation. She had been promoted 4 more times since the night she filed her first report about Yunho's nod. She had spent 8 years watching and documenting and being right about things before the people above her understood that she was right. She had developed a reputation for being patient. She thought about what patience actually meant, watching Darai sit at the table. Verath had always thought of patience as waiting, as tolerating the slow movement of time. That was what she had been taught. You were patient when you sat still and accepted that things would take as long as they took. But that was not what she had been watching for 8 years. What she had been watching was something more active than that. Humans had not been sitting still. They had been building, constantly and carefully, in every direction. The patience was not in the waiting. It was in the refusal to hurry, in doing each step correctly rather than quickly, in understanding that the outcome was not in question, which meant the only thing that mattered was not making mistakes in the process. That was a different thing entirely from the patience she had been taught. Across the chamber, Dari turned her head and caught Verath's eye. It was a brief moment, accidental in appearance, the natural crossing of 2 gazes in a busy room. But Dari held it for just a second and gave a single nod. Small, unhurried, the kind of nod that said, "I see you, and I know what you know." Then she turned back to the table. Verath opened her personal log. She had been keeping it for 8 years. She had filled hundreds of pages with observations and analysis and questions she could not answer at the time but had answered later. She scrolled to the end and wrote one final entry. She wrote, "The humans were never afraid of being removed from the room. They were waiting for the right moment to build a bigger one, and then they invited everyone in." She paused. Then she added, "Everyone who deserved to be." She closed the log. On the chamber floor, the new joint assembly was called to order for the first time. The sound of the gavel was different from the old council gavel, quieter, softer, made from a wood that came from a tree species native to Earth, given as a small gift by the Accord delegation to the assembly's first presiding official. It rang once, clean and clear, and the room settled into the kind of purposeful quiet that comes at the beginning of something real, not the quiet of an ending, the quiet of a start. Outside the station's long viewports, the stars were steady and unchanged, as they always were, patient in the way that only very large and very old things can be, not waiting for anything in particular, simply present, simply continuing, and entirely indifferent to whether the small, brief, complicated beings moving between them had finally figured out how to do the same.